They are Sumarthi Medical College will be presenting a seminar on Neuro-Biology of Reward Pathway. So these are the things which we are going to cover. Basic introduction, impulsivity and compulsivity, reward pathway and its neurobiology, phases of reward processing, types, and its role in clinical conditions like addiction, depression, schizophrenia, and frequently asked questions, summary, and the references. Introduction. So basically, reward pathway is a network of brain structures involved in the regulation of pleasure, motivation, and reinforcement of behaviors by releasing neurotransmitters like dopamine. These structures are activated by rewarding or pleasurable stimuli, such as food, interactions, drugs, play a role in motivation, pleasure, reinforcement learning, and development of addiction as well. So these are the key components, which are the ventral tegmental area, which produces the dopamine, nucleus accumbens, which processes the reward signals, prefrontal cortex, involved in decision making and impulse control, and amygdala and hippocampus, which handle the emotional responses and memory. This is the diagram which depicts the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, which the red one which depicts the mesolimbic tract. So, firstly, it's very important to discuss impulsivity and compulsivity. Impulsivity is the acting without forethought, the lack of reflection on the consequence of one's behavior, the inability to postpone the reward with preference for immediate reward over more beneficial but delayed reward, and is a failure of motor inhibition, often choosing to be a risky behavior, lacking the willpower not to give in to the temptations. Whereas compulsivity is the actions inappropriate to the situation, but which nevertheless persist and often result in undesirable consequence. Compulsions are characterized by inability to adapt behavior after negative feedback. Habits are the type of compulsion which can be seen as a responses triggered by environmental stimuli, regardless of the current desirability of that consequence. So habits can be conditioned responses, example as drug seeking, food seeking, gambling, or to a conditioned stimulus, such as being around people or places, items associated with drugs, food, or gambling in the past, that have been reinforced and strengthened either by past experience with reward, either positive reinforcement, or with emission of an aversive event, loss of the negative reinforcement. So a person starts a substance to obtain its positive effects such as disinhibition, amnesia, enjoyment, etc., all leading to pleasure. Such with successive events of consumption, the amount of pleasure associated with particular quantity of the substance reduces due to development of tolerance. The person is therefore forced to increase the amount of substance consumed to obtain the same amount of pleasure. So this is a pic taken from Stahl's, which depicts the impulsivity and the compulsivity, how it starts, and the whole spectrum, the things which are marked in arrow around the both circles are the disorders which are involved because of the pathway of the mesolimbic pathway and is associated with the impulsivity and compulsivity. With impulsivity associates for anterior cingulate cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which sends the signal to the ventral striatum and thalamus, which keeps again sending the signal to the same. And similarly, compulsivity involves the dorsal striatum, which receives the signals from the orbitofrontal cortex. And its connection is basically related with the mesolimbic pathway or the reward pathway. Again, impulsivity and compulsivity circuit, which was depicted earlier as well. The progression from occasional impulsive drug use to compulsive use and addiction involves the dysregulation of the bottom of reward circuits and insufficient top-down inhibition of these circuits, which will be explained later. The amygdala and hippocampus provide early regulatory input to this system as well. Anterior cingulate cortex and DLPFC, and these are the things which are associated with it. Now coming to the reward pathway. So it's the mesolimbic pathway which originates in the ventral tegmental area and projects to the ventral striatum, particularly the nucleus accumbens, but also other limbic areas like amygdala and hippocampus. It's located in the ventral striatum, and it's a part of dopamine system which is also involved in the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. It's considered the brain's reward center and the dopamine as the neurotransmitter of the pleasure. So all substances directly or indirectly act on reward pathway to release dopamine. So the reinforcing effects of the drugs are largely determined not only by the presence of dopamine, but also by the rate of increasing dopamine in the brain, which is dictated by the speed with which the drug enters and leaves the brain. The rate of the drug uptake is subjected to route of administration, with IV and inhalation being the fastest, followed by snorting as well. Different drugs of use have different reward values based on the individual mechanism of action. So these are the natural activation of the mesolimbic dopamine, which are naturally activated, triggered by the natural highs, intellectual, athletic accomplishments, music, social bonding, orgasms. It involves naturally occurring neurotransmitters, endorphins, natural opioids, anandamide, natural cannabinoid, and acetylcholine, dopamine itself. Now the drug-induced activation. All addictive drugs increase dopamine in the ventral striatum. Drugs cause faster and more intense dopamine release than the natural reward, which directly stimulate the receptors, bypassing the normal neurotransmitter control, which results in the supernormal rewards that are immediate, intense, and are reinforcing. Also, behavioral addictions also activate the system. Not just drugs, behaviors like gambling, excessive internet use, shopping, eating, they can also stimulate dopamine release, fitting into the impulsive compulsive disorder spectrum. With repeated drug use initiates neuroadaptations. From ventral striatum loop to dorsal striatum loop, there's a habit loop in which from the passing from the impulsivity to compulsivity, it leads to the withdrawal symptoms because of the increased tolerance and increased craving. Preoccupation with the drug seeking begins a cycle of abuse, addiction, and the dependence. So this is also a pic taken from the book itself, which depicts the impulsivity, which produces the high, and with which leads to firstly the binge intoxication or excessive behavior of the substance taking. Then with dependence, abstinence, withdrawal, and negative features are seen, which eventually leads to the anticipation, preoccupation, craving, and the arousal, causing the compulsivity, which keeps on revolving in a loop. Coming to the phases of reward processing. So it has four parts. Firstly is the anticipation, also called the reward prediction or incentive salience. It involves dopamine release in response to cues predicting a reward. The brain prepares itself to act to obtain the reward. The key areas are the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. Second is the consumption, which is the actual experience of the reward. It is linked to the pleasure and the satisfaction associated with the drug use. It's less dependent on the dopamine, more on opioid, endocannabinoid, and GABAergic systems. It also involves the key brain areas like nucleus accumbens and orbitofrontal cortex, and insula as well. Learning. With repetitive use, there is a reward-based learning which develops, which is the associations between the cues, actions, and the rewards are formed. Involves reinforcement learning, learning what leads to a reward. The key brain areas involved are the hippocampus for the contextual learning, amygdala for the emotional learning, and dorsal stratum, which, as was stated earlier in the compulsivity, as a habit learning, and medial prefrontal cortex as well. So finally is the habit formation, which is in the compulsivity. With repetition, the behavior becomes automatic and compulsive. The dopamine signaling shifts from the ventral to the dorsal stratum, and control shifts from the goal-directed activity to a habitual behavior. It's become difficult to stop, even if reward diminishes or even with negative consequences. Right. So it develops a cycle of craving, which leads to the drug behavior use and the reinforcement habit strengthening and the compulsive use. Now coming to the types of reward system. First is a reactive reward system or the bottoms up approach. It is responsible for the temptation for which the substance is sought after the primary use. It consists of the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, amygdala, which has connections with both the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. So the rewarding input to the nucleus accumbens is due to the dopamine release from the ventral tegmental area, leading to the potentiation of a reward as a result, which produces the high, for which there's a temptation for. And also the connections of dopaminergic neurons with amygdala are involved with reward learning, such as memory of pleasure associated with the drug abuse, with connections of amygdala back to ventral tegmental area, communicate whether anything relevant to a previously experienced pleasure was detected or not. Connections of the amygdala with the nucleus accumbens communicate that emotions have been triggered by internal or external cues and signal as an impulsive, almost reflexive response to be taken. Now coming to the reflective reward system, which is also the top-down approach. It is responsible for the willpower, which if is intact, patient is able to control the drug-seeking behavior. It consists of the projections from the prefrontal cortex to the nucleus accumbens, the corticostriatal portion of the corticostriatothalamic cortical junction loops. Projections from the orbitofrontal cortex are involved in regulating impulses. Also, projections from ventromedial prefrontal cortex are involved in regulating the emotions. Projections for the DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, involved in the analyzing situations and regulating whether an action takes place or not. So this is the reactive reward system and the reflective reward system, which shows the different neurotransmitters which basically act upon the nucleus accumbens and producing the reward, which is because of the potentiation of the conditioned reward, and which is the responsible for the temptation. And reflective one is the one which gets sent back, which produces the willpower for the drug seeking behavior, which is hampered in patients of substance use disorders. Now talking about the individual substances for the regulation of reward. All the substances are basically related to the mesolimbic system as a final pathway, but initially they act on the specific receptors, which eventually causes the dopamine release. Firstly, we'll talk about the nicotine. It causes the dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens by binding with alpha 4 beta 2 nicotinic postsynaptic receptors on the dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area. It desensitizes the alpha 4 beta 2 receptors in the GABA interneurons in ventral tegmental area, therefore decreasing the GABA neurotransmission, leading to the decreased inhibition of ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens, because of which there is excessive dopamine release even with nicotine use. Alcohol, effect on the reward pathway. It acts on the mu receptors or causes the release of endogenous opioids like enkephalins. Also acts on the presynaptic glutamate receptors and presynaptic voltage sensitive calcium channels to inhibit the glutamate release, and increases the GABA by blocking presynaptic GABA B receptors. And through direct or indirect actions at GABA A receptors, it disinhibits dopamine neurons in the VTA, which leads to increased dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, which produces the effects. It acts upon the mu receptors, mu opioid receptors, especially in the VTA and the nucleus accumbens. Its effect on the reward pathway, opioid bind to the mu opioid receptors on GABAergic interneurons in the ventral tegmental area, which inhibit GABA release and disinhibits dopamine neurons, which increases the dopamine, like earlier stated, which produces the intense euphoria and the strong reinforcement. Cannabis, it acts on the cannabinoid receptors, especially in the VTA, hippocampus, and cortex. It activates the cannabinoid receptor CB1 and suppresses GABAergic input to dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area, which cause the disinhibition of dopamine release. Like stated, we had discussed the role of mesolimbic system in causing addictions. Now talking about the role in causing depression. Dopamine involves the depression involves the hypoactivity or underactivation of the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which reduce dopamine release from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, which leads to the diminished reward perception, decreased motivation, and emotional blunting as well. So the key symptoms which are related to it are the anhedonia, with the inability to feel pleasure due to weak dopamine signaling in the nucleus accumbens, and low motivation with lack of reinforcement signal to pursue rewarding activities, and social withdrawal with loss of interest in previously pleasurable social interactions as well, and emotional flatness, reduced activation of the amygdala and nucleus accumbens in response to the stimuli. Its role in causing schizophrenia, it involves the hyperactivity of dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway. Dopaminergic overdrive from the ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens causes abnormal salience attribution, because of which the irrelevant stimuli are perceived as significant. So the symptoms linked to the mesolimbic dysfunction would be the hallucinations, because of excess dopamine causes the false perception of stimuli, delusions, and the paranoia. The heightened emotional responses from amygdala misfiring. The dopamine hypothesis of the schizophrenia causes the positive symptoms as described earlier, and the negative symptoms, the social withdrawal, are thought to result from the dopamine deficit in the mesocortical pathway from ventral tegmental area to the prefrontal cortex. The frequently asked questions. Firstly, how does the mesolimbic pathway contribute to the rewards? From causing the release of dopamine from the ventral tegmental area. When a person encounters a rewarding stimulus, the dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area becomes activated. The rewarding stimulus can be food, sex, social interaction, or drugs. And from the VTA, the dopamine reaches to the nucleus accumbens, which leads to the feeling of pleasure or satisfaction, increased motivation to seek the stimulus again, and strengthening of behaviors associated with the reward, which is the reinforcement learning. Amygdala and hippocampus are involved later, which assigns the emotional value to the reward, with hippocampus forms a memory of the context where the reward had occurred in the past. Also to the prefrontal cortex, which evaluates the importance of the reward, helps with decision making and goal directed behavior. Can the reward circuit influence learning and motivation? It is the engine of motivated learning. Reinforcement learning, when we do something that leads to a reward, like solving a problem or eating a favorite food, dopamine is released, which reinforces the behavior, making it more likely to be repeated. This is the positive reinforcement, a core part of the habit formation and the skill learning. What happens when the reward system is dysfunctional? It leads to disorders like depression, schizophrenia, addiction, and ADHDs as well. It can be trained as well as modified, the reward system, because of the brain's neuroplasticity. How it can be trained or modified? By behavioral conditioning with reinforcement learning, which strengthens the dopamine pathways and habit formation. With cognitive behavior therapies, mindfulness and meditations, exercise, diets, and reducing artificial rewards as well. Reducing exposure to dopamine overstimulators like junk food, social media, drugs helps reset the brain reward baseline, a process known as the dopamine detox. Does stress impact the reward circuit? It does. It reduces the dopamine activity. Stress hormones like cortisol interfere with the dopamine production and its release in the mesolimbic pathway, which causes the anhedonia, less motivation to pursue rewards, impaired learning from the positive outcomes. Also shrinks the reward-related brain areas. Chronic stress over a prolonged period of time can shrink the prefrontal cortex involved in the decision making and weakens connections between the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens and the hippocampus, which impairs the goal setting, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. Also increases the risk of addiction and depression. Stress lowers the natural reward response, making a person more vulnerable to depression and more likely to seek artificial rewards like drugs, alcohol, overeating to feel better temporarily, and also at risk of for addictive behavior due to stress relief patterns. So how neuroplasticity and reward pathway are related with the learning and habit formation. Repeated activation of the reward pathway strengthens the synaptic connections, which is a plasticity, which is the core behind the neuroplasticity, which reinforces the behavior patterns. Also, addiction substances behaviors hijack this pathway and causing abnormal neuroplastic changes, reinforcing maladaptive habits. Therapy and recovery. Behavioral therapies and medications rewire these circuits, leveraging neuroplasticity to undo harmful patterns. Motivational learning. Dopaminergic signaling drives attention and memory for reward-related events, shaping future behavior through the plastic changes. So the artificial interventions to regulate dopamine, firstly is the pharmacological. These directly or indirectly modulate dopamine levels. The dopamine agonists, examples pramipexole and opinarole, stimulants, antidepressants, and the antipsychotics. The other neuromodulation technologies which are also used with the deep brain stimulation helps regulate dopamine release and reward processing in treatment-resistant depression, Parkinson disease, addictions, which is under experiment for the addiction. And also the transcranial magnetic stimulation, non-invasive magnetic stimulation of prefrontal cortex indirectly influences the dopamine circuits. It is FDA approved for depression and OCD. Transcranial direct current stimulation, it is still under experiment. The thirdly and the novel is the gene therapy and the molecular technologies with dopamine gene editing, which upregulates the dopamine synthesis, normalize receptor function in the genetic dopamine disorders. Also viral vector delivery genes that enhance dopamine transporter receptor. It's the psychedelics and the novel drug therapies with psychedelics, example psilocybin and ketamine, which rapidly influence dopaminergic and glutamatergic systems, potentially resetting the reward pathways. Shows strong promise for the depression, PTSD, and addictions. Cannabinoid modulators. The influence dopamine indirectly through the cannabinoid 1 receptor in the ventral tegmental area, with research currently going for its role in the addiction treatment. So, in all likelihood, I would like to conclude with the reward pathway as the brain structures, group of brain structures that are activated by the rewarding or the reinforcing stimuli, such as food, interaction, addictive drugs, plays a role in the motivation, pleasure, learning, reinforcement of behaviors. How it works? A rewarding stimulus should be present, which activates the ventral tegmental area, which causes the dopamine release into the nucleus accumbens, which creates the feeling of the pleasure and the reinforcement. The prefrontal cortex evaluates the experience and influences the future behavior regarding it. With memory via the relation with hippocampus and emotional context formed with the help of amygdala, help recall and reassign the value to the experience in the context. The clinical relevance, relevant in the addiction studies. In addictions, many addictive substances, uh, they interact and hijack this pathway by flooding it with dopamine and reinforcing the drug taking behavior. Also in other mental health conditions like depression and schizophrenia, because of the low reward sensitivity and the abnormal dopamine signaling respectively. My references. Thank you.